We have a final panel, and I know one of the panelists has to leave almost exactly on at the end of the panel. This panel will address new roles for international broadcasting and public media curation and engagement. So I'll welcome to the platform Heather Chaplin, Assistant Professor of the New School, Beth Curley, President and CEO of National Public Television. I'm afraid I cannot bring Ben Scott. Good news and bad news there. Ben Scott is a new dad, and I believe he and his new child are watching online, but he cannot be here. So congratulations, Ben, but we can't. Sorry you can't make it. And also Jason Sykin and moderator Ellen Goodman. So please put your hands together and for the last panel of the day. Thank you.
Good afternoon. At this point in the program, we have discussed the evolving international broadcasting and public media missions in a networked digital world. And now we want to specifically explore new tools for engaging publics in mission-related content. So what we've tried to do in this program by bringing together two communities that don't usually talk to each other or convene much, the international broadcasting community and the public media community, is to explore this meaning of mission. They're separate missions, but that they are both characterized by sort of deliberate missions, and they are also operate as non-commercial entities. How do those missions change in the digital world? How does digital technology and methods of engagement change the production of news, the distribution or diffusion of news, and by news we can also be talking about entertainment and culture, the engagement function, and this is what we'll focus on here, what are the roles of mobile, social media, and gaming platforms? I'd like to start with you, Ivan, if I can. We've been talking mostly about professional journalism, and we've also been talking about American foreign correspondents abroad. You have spent your career, I think, with over a decade in Southeast and Central Asia on assisting in the development of local capacity for news gathering. So I'd like you to talk about the role of local news gathering, the role of the non-professional journalist in our information ecosystem, and perhaps you can begin by describing Global Voices, which is the outfit that you run now. What does it do, and how does it view its mission?
Okay, so I work for Global Voices Online. It's a community of volunteer translators and authors who roughly right now about 400 people who collectively analyze, aggregate, and curate the most interesting online conversations as found in citizen media contexts. And we do this by collectively looking around the world and finding writers and translators who are very well versed in local contexts and local communities and are able to identify conversations and stories that are current and interesting to local audiences. So we invert the news gathering editorial structure by asking first, what are people talking about? And our concern is to listen. Our concern is to encourage an engagement with the world that starts by asking, what is it that people themselves what are their concerns, and then trying to consolidate and amplify that information in a uniform way across our site, so that readers can come to the site and understand local contexts and local conversations for global audiences. And I think that's a really important thing in the context of this conversation, because when we've been talking about audience, one thing I've noticed is that we've rarely actually thought about audience segmentation. I mean, in the context of the American audience, for instance, the fact that 20% of America is Latino, and that the largest growing news organizations in the American context are ethnic media. That's a very different market from the market we've been discussing. In the context of foreign broadcasting or international broadcasting, I think it's really important to understand that the people who are receiving the content that is coming from both the international broadcasters and from the American government broadcast mechanisms are receiving this material and the information from us in the context of their own production of information. And it is not the case that if you receive VOA, in most cases you're only receiving VOA. You're receiving it and you're comparing it to other information sources that come from your community, whether it's an informal information gathering structure or a community radio or a website or a national broadcaster. And we have developed, as we start to move to digital media technologies, the beginnings of a rhetoric of conversation. I think one of the earlier panelists said that the news is the conversation. But when it comes to the question of having a genuine conversation with people who live in other countries and having the perception that, for instance, the VOA is a conversational partner, there's the essential question of who owns the platform and who is dictating the terms of what that conversation is. And I think if we're talking about the perception of America in that context, one of the big kind of contradictions in this space is that the American position has a huge impact on people around the world, and yet the people with whom we are speaking are not enfranchised in our system. They are citizens of other countries, and they feel profoundly disempowered by. And in general, they have no power. It's not a question. They're only empowered through their own governments about what happens in our context. And so I think the first question is about the nature of trust on the platforms in which people are communicating. When you start to move beyond the fairly traditional news frame of a broadcast soundbite and a scarcity of time whereby content goes out, that is not the future of news. That is not where the news industry is moving. It is moving towards an abundance of information, and the challenge is to contextualize and find accurate content that is relevant to a particular place and time. And as we see in the American context, it's kind of counter to what we see in a lot of cable television here. And I think I'll stop there for now. I think it's a good start.
Let me just follow up. You mentioned the word curate, and that's a word we're all using a lot, certainly in public media, that the role is not just the creation of content, but the curation of conversations and content. And so what I want to ask about is the sort of curatorial voice, curatorial authority. Where does that come from in terms of trust? We all know that we all rely on multiple curators, whether that's social media or a news aggregator or a brand like a trusted brand such as PBS. Where does the curatorial authority of Global Voices, where is it vested, and how is it that people come to believe it?
Right. Well, there's two kinds of brands, I think. There's the traditional mass market brand, mass media brand, which is promoted which has editorial structures which are opaque to people who are outside of them, for the most part. And that brand and the nature of the trust of that brand is promoted through a combination of advertising and a demonstration of effect over time. Right? So I say something, it's true, and I report a story, and over time you as audience say, well, that really corresponds to my vision of my understanding of the world around me, so it sounds accurate. Of course, in fact, if we do fact-checking on all sorts of news stories, we find all sorts of errors all the time, so maybe some of that trust is misplaced. The online networked media environment, the version of trust in the curation space, the ideal, is transparency. And that transparency comes through links. It comes through the sourcing of an identification of the content, of where the content came from. So Global Voices does have an editorial policy. The people who write for it are not allowed to inject their own content. But the important thing is that we're trying to say, look, this conversation is occurring. We think it's interesting. You know who we are. Here's our name. Here's our profile. Here's our background. And it's up to you to decide whether or not you think it's interesting. And if you disagree, you're welcome to comment. In fact, you're welcome to join. So that's the nature of the trust proposition that we put forward.
I want to turn to Beth Curley. Since you mentioned ethnic media, it's a growing area, but it's also very underserved. Ethnic groups in the U.S. are very underserved, and it strikes me that when we're talking about President Bollinger's suggestion that we are underserved with foreign news, related to that, we are also very underserved with even knowing who our neighbors are. And so at Nashville Public Television, you embarked on a new project to sort of help us with that information gap, and we wanted you to talk about it, and we have this video to see too.
I'll talk about it just for 1 second and show you the video and then come back to it. This is a very different project than everything that you've heard about today. It's strictly a local project. It's a project that we developed in Nashville because through some other work we were doing, we realized that we had a much more diverse community than even we were aware. In the Metro Nashville school system, there are 80 different languages spoken, and because of some education work that we were doing in the non-broadcast arena, we became familiar with many of these different communities, and we realized, hey, I'm an old producer. It's like, how can we not produce something about this? We need to get this out for the entire community. And we came up with this Next Door Neighbors project, essentially to introduce some of the immigrant and refugee communities who are living in the Metro Nashville area to everyone else who's living in the Metro Nashville area. And I think at this point, let's go ahead and just about a 3-minute overview of the project, and then we can get back to the project.
In the last 30 years, Nashville, Tennessee has become a destination for immigrants and refugees, but their stories often remain untold.
When we were about to get here, we were provided an orientation. They said, USA, you start again. So it's like we have to start again here.
In 4 documentaries, Nashville Public Television explores the stories of 4 communities, capturing new life in a mid-sized Southern American town.
Often my sisters and I, we joke about it and we say we're the Americans because we're not fully Kurds, we're not fully Americans, and we're in between.
I feel very passionate about Nashville, and when I talk about Nashville, it's like I'm talking about my city.
Each community brings a changing combination of assets and challenges, but they are unified by a common aspiration. They all seek a better life, a permanent solution, and a new home.
But for us, I think we're trying to have some kind of good life at least, because we have struggled a lot to have some good future. So I am looking, just dreaming for something better which can help me to, progress.
New lives and a new identity for Nashville and our next-door neighbors.
If we educate ourselves and our young generation, we can catch up with this fast-moving life in America, which is the final goal. How we can take the positive and drop the negative, and then be part of the community, the big moving community.
Right after the Next Door Neighbors came out with a Little Kurdistan, speaking from the Kurdish community, MPT became well known, and they saw MPT as, a respectful educational source. It created like a bridge building between the Kurdish community and the non-Kurdish community. I mean, we had great feedback. I remember even just going to the shopping centers at a local store, and people would come up to me and say, hey, I saw you on TV, and it was about Kurdistan. I didn't know that many people existed in Nashville and who they are, where they came from. And to me, I felt, happy and in a way inspired. MPT to me provides great community service. I'm Kassar Abdullah, and NPT is my source for educational and inspiring programming.
And I can say that Kassar has become a rock star in Nashville. Honestly, she cannot go anywhere without people recognizing her. This is a multidisciplinary project. We are out there in the educational realm. We're out there using these various programs for trainings in companies with diverse workforces. The programs have been used. One example is there was a chicken processing plant in our area, and there was a lot of employee tension between some of the Somali workers and some of the other workers. And some of the people who worked on this Somali project brought this film down and used it to really open some minds, and it was a great use of this kind of local media. And I know a lot of what we're talking about today is actually globalization and international uses of media. And much to our surprise, again, we're a community licensed public television station, and we did this program for our community with no intention whatsoever of distributing it. Very specifically local work. And we found that because of the trust that we had built up in the immigrant and refugee communities, they started sharing all of this information with their communities throughout this country and throughout the world. We put all the programs on our website. They're all on YouTube. And things have actually changed very much in the 3 years that we started this project. The first program was on the Kurdish population, which is the largest in the United States. And we got a request from somebody early on to broadcast this program in Iraq. And we kind of looked at each other and said, what? And we actually said no, because we had no way of figuring out whether that was a good idea or not a good idea. We just didn't have any way to evaluate that. And of course it was online, so anybody could see it online. Well, a couple of years later, we found out that the project on the Somalis in particular has been broadcast in Somali. These programs are now just swiped and they're broadcast around the world without our permission, which is fine with us. It's just the way the world has changed. So I think that's an interesting example of the global impact of an extremely local program. And we did say in that piece that it was a 4-year project, and that's how it was designed. And I do have to give a shout out to CPB. They provided the initial funding for this project, which really helped us garner additional local support for this. And we are extending the project for another 2 years. The next community we're profiling is the Sudanese, and we'll do another one next year. We haven't decided which one that will be.
So maybe when we get to Q&A, I'd be really curious to hear what Rena Golden thinks about whether or not there's opportunity in the footage that ends up on the cutting room floor in Atlanta, whether that could be repurposed in local communities where there are diasporic communities that are interested in reporting in certain parts of the world. So what Beth is, I'm going to turn to you, Jason. What Beth has shown us is sort of a concrete way that a public television station in this case has really connected with its community and sort of proven out its value. Digital tools demand that of us and also allow us to take some of the guesswork out of whether or not we are actually connecting, whether we are relevant, because it can be gauged through interactivity and engagement with the content. So can you tell us a little bit about what PBS is doing with its content online and in the mobile space?
Sure. Let me before I get to that, let me just make an editorial comment, because I've been to a lot of conferences like this that discuss the future of journalism, and there's usually a fair amount of angst, somewhat rightly so. My personal opinion, based on what we've seen at PBS, is that there's definitely a business case model, a business case problem with journalism, but there's not. Journalism itself, I don't think, and I've spent the first 15 years of my life in newsrooms, journalism itself has never been healthier. And I also believe that, and a lot of the angst comes from the fact that sites like, in a world where sites like TMZ.com and ParisHilton.com and all the rest are so popular, what does this mean really for the future of serious journalism? What we've seen is at PBS is that the audiences, if you give the audience quality and professionally produced journalism and documentaries and other forms of content, there's actually a great appetite out there for that. So one example would be, we really only got serious about putting video online maybe 18 to 24 months ago, and in that time we've gone from 2 million streams a month to 89 million streams a month. So PBS is now the 17th most popular, PBS.org is the 17th most popular video site on the web. And our kids sites, pbskids.org, are the number one, by far, the number one kids site for video, with 3.3 million hours of video watched last month. And if you compare PBS, just taking kids as an example, if you compare the PBS kids video to the competitors, Nick or Disney or Cartoon Network, ours is non-commercial. It's all based on educational curriculum. So someone on an earlier panel mentioned people not wanting to eat their spinach, and we make that joke at PBS a lot about, sometimes the audience thinks of PBS as peas and carrots, and they don't want to eat peas and carrots, and we're really giving kids peas and carrots and broccoli, but in the form that's actually tasteful and tasty. So I guess my message is really that there is a very wide audience, a very large audience out there for serious journalism, for serious sort of public service content. The second thing that sort of not really trend, but observation that I've made over my few years at PBS is that when we talk about the future of journalism, journalism business model and the quality of journalism is one issue that needs to be addressed. But really another key element that's intertwined with that is education. Because if we do raise I grew up in an era, and I'm dating myself here, but an era where the media choices, the journalism choices were limited. So it was Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley and Time Magazine and New York Times. And there may be a half dozen to a dozen choices out there. Now, of course, there's almost unlimited choices. So if we raise a generation of children who aren't media literate and aren't able to make wise choices about what is a reliable website, what's a site that you can trust, what's an aggregator site, what's a site that is really opinion disguised as reporting. If we don't do that, if we don't raise a media savvy generation, then we will see sites like the less serious sites grow and dominate and really become the winners in the long run. So I think that that journalists and educators, and we do have an education crisis in this country, and if we don't fix the education crisis, we're never going to be able to fix the journalism crisis. So I guess I'll stop right there. Let me just make one more point, actually, which is to try to finally answer your question, which is what we've really seen in terms of engagement. What is engaging an audience online? It's really 3 or 4 things. So video, definitely. I mentioned some numbers earlier, but also the other number I'll mention is when we look at our long-form video on pbs.org and on the PBS for the iPad, the average per video use is 21 minutes. So, which is, the latest number I saw for Hulu was 6 minutes. So 21 minutes per video. So people are definitely engaged with video. The second one is games, particularly for kids. I said earlier that pbskids.org was the number one video site for kids, but actually games, in terms of when we look at our traffic on kids, pbskids.org, games is the number one thing that they do, not video. And third would be mobile. Mobile is just, mobile changes everything. Some panelists earlier have mentioned the meteoric rise of mobile, but I think that we're all underestimating the where mobile's going to be. I was going to say 3 years from now, but it's really 3 months from now. And finally, social media. We now have more than 1 million followers and fans on Facebook and Twitter, and we get a huge amount of traffic from those. Finally, my final point would be that when you talk earlier, you asked earlier, Ellen, about the power of a brand to be a curator. You would expect me, being from PBS, to say, yeah, of course, people turn to our brand to sort the wheat from the chaff. I think that's true to some extent. I think the most powerful curator has always been word of mouth, and in the world of Facebook and Twitter, word of mouth has become much more easy and much more ubiquitous. And I saw a number recently that Facebook now refers more traffic to news sites, news and information sites, than Google News does. So it's really, I think, in terms of driving traffic to serious journalism sites, if you're not in really seriously in the social media game, then you're really missing out on that opportunity, that word of mouth opportunity.
Well, you mentioned games, so I have to now turn to Heather. One of the things we heard in the last panel was it's critical to make what's important interesting, and there's a way in which gaming and participatory culture in general is a mechanism for that, to take the broccoli, the spinach, whatever we're going to call it, that is news, or maybe particularly global news, and make it interesting. But then there's another aspect of the gaming form, which is making information comprehensible when it already is interesting, or whether or not it's interesting. So maybe you can talk about both aspects of gaming.
Yeah, it's interesting. People tend to approach games when it's anything outside of the commercial sector, sort of like, oh, the kids are doing it, so we should get involved and make a game out of it. And, I mean, kids do play games, and it is where a lot of the popular culture is, so I'm not saying anything against that argument. But what I think is much more interesting is to actually pay attention to what a game is, and in what ways are games good at expressing certain kinds of information. Because I think games can be another tool in our arsenal as journalists, especially as news moves online and interactive applications become more and more important. Games are really good at explaining how things work, because a game is essentially a model. So, like, imagine you want to learn about the solar system. You could read a bunch of text that explained what the planets were and what they look like and how close or how far apart they are from one another and what their characteristics are. Or you could build an orrery, right? Does everyone know what that is? They started in the 18th century. They were like mechanical toys where you actually have the planets hanging. You know, kids make them with styrofoam balls and pipe cleaners. So you can imagine that an orrery might be a much better way to learn about the solar system than just reading a text, because you can actually walk around it and you can see the perspective and how things are related. So I kind of believe that different mediums are good at expressing different things. And so let me tell you a little bit about what already exists in terms of gaming and journalism. It's interesting that you mentioned the relationship between journalism and education, because a lot of my work has actually been about games and learning. And I've sort of recently begun to think about games and journalism, and I think there's really a role here. The other thing I just wanted to point out is that, a lot of times, like, I'll tell people that I cover video games, and they sort of laugh like this is this very funny thing or not very important. And the thing that I would just say to keep in mind is that play is how primates learn, right? So play is actually this incredibly powerful thing. And all that a game is creating a space, whether it's a virtual space on a computer or a space on a field, where people can play. So play is experimenting, it's being creative. I've heard people talk about play as being akin to the scientific process. It's the essential what if, right? I have a set of rules, I'm going to push back against those rules and see what happens. So something wonderful happens and informative and educational when people play. So we have games right now that are being used as sort of the equivalent of editorials. One of my favorite examples is Oil God, right? So this was an editorial that ran in the New York Times, and it's a 2-minute game, and the point of the game is you win by making oil prices go up high, and you do that by wreaking havoc all over the world, okay? Another game made by the same company shortly after 9/11 was called Airport Security, and you had to get people through the security system, but the rules of what you could bring on the plane changed like every 2 or 3 seconds, right? So these are... Right, so you can see that there's a pretty natural relationship for short, small video games to be the editorial cartoons of the future, right? Or on a more meaningful level, there was a game called September 12th. Oh, don't even worry about it. If I can't play them, it doesn't... Just the images don't help that much, but thank you. There's a wonderful game. One of the earliest in this news games is called September 12th, and it's about retaliating for September 11th. But every time you retaliate, a new terrorist comes into existence. So the only way to win is not to play. So that's kind of an interesting message. Now, I also think, like I was starting to say before, games are really good at showing how things work. Not to get too deep and theoretical here, but games are systems. And what's a system? A system is a set of interrelated parts that together form a whole that's something bigger than any of the parts independently, right? So our government, democracy, it's a system, right? So global warming is a system. The way that we drive our cars in Washington, D.C. affects the ice caps, which affect the polar bears, and decisions made about the kind of pollution that coal plants can release affects the way the wind blows in Europe, which affects the cancer rate, right? This interconnectedness, and there's been a lot of talk today about how we live in an increasingly globalized world, which is essentially a world of interconnection. And games are all about interconnections, because all a game is a little model of a system, right? If you're playing Mario Brothers, you jump on a platform, you get a coin, that coin allows you to go somewhere else where you eat a mushroom. By eating the mushroom, you can go in the door, by eating the door, you can get the key, right? So it's really good at fostering this sense of systemic thinking and reflects really well the interconnected world that we live in. So like a game that's out there right now, it's a widget. And it was made by American Public Media, and it's called Budget Hero. And so it has all of the real data about the budget, but it's represented visually. It's kind of like an infographics put into play. So you decide, well, I'm going to cut military spending, and you see visually what happens, and you really try to balance the budget by watching the different facets of the budget go up and down and by making different decisions. There also are documentary games. I think my sense is that, like you were speaking earlier about documentaries, films being so good at really, really deep analysis. And I'm not sure that that's what video games are best at. Like that might be something we continue to let documentary film do. But games are good, like I said, at showing how things work. Getting at the interconnectedness and complexity of things. Games are great for teaching emergence, chaos theory, complexity, all of these things that we really need to understand in the 21st century. And there's also a movement towards documentary games. And the one that I'll bring up as an example, which I would say is not a deep analysis the way like a documentary film might be, but is really good at putting you in the shoes of someone else because you play as a character, was a very controversial game that came out maybe 5 years ago at this point called Super Columbine Massacre role-playing game. hugely controversial. And what the game maker did, it was done in like a early 90s Nintendo side scroller, so it was very eerie because you felt like you were playing a child's game and it should be about childish things, but you actually were playing as Dylan Harris and Eric Klebold, the Columbine murderers, and you went through the day exactly like they did, shot up the cafeteria, and then went and killed yourself. And it's interspersed, this sort of 2D Nintendo styles interspersed with the real audio of them talking to each other that day and visual clips. And it's incredibly powerful. I mean, it just, you really, the way like a great feature story will kind of like take you past the news into the depth of what something was like so that you can experience it. I think games can be really powerful that way.
Yeah, well, so I want to follow up with you and also get Jason's views on this next question. One of the subtexts for this whole program, I think, has been about specialization and tasks. The digitally networked world allows us to outsource a lot of tasks and work in partnership with other entities. So we've talked about that. Do you need your own correspondent? Can you use others? Do you need your own coder if you're a news organization, or can you outsource, or not just outsource, but rely on others to create games, since news is essentially open source? So I guess the question is, do you think it, the counter-argument would be, no, you really want to have that in-house because it changes the way you'd go about your news gathering if you knew that at the end of the day you wanted to have games or other kinds of data visualizations to explain and engage around the topic. So what do you think about that? Do you think it needs to be in-house, or can the whole game ecosystem develop outside of the professional news organizations? And then Jason, we'll get your views on that.
I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the problem is that with games in particular, it's the computer game games are ancient, but the computer game is relatively new. So just like it took film a long time to go from being a fairly low-level affair to being, what we think of it as now, video games are only 30-something years old, and I don't think there's... So the point has to be that how do we get people who understand the deepest journalistic values and can translate that into the medium of a game. And I'm not sure there's that many people that exist right now that have both those mindsets. I'm thinking a friend of mine is the interactive editor at the New York Times who does their interactives, and he's always talking about just how hard it is to find people who have a really strong journalistic sense and can program cool interactive stuff to make the news more accessible. And I feel like it's sort of the same problem in games. But the other thing I'd say is the generation kind of below me, the people who grew up with the Nintendo Entertainment System, they know games. Like, it's just the way we know TV and we know movies. Like, they're going to grow up, and if they want to be journalists, it'll just be natural to think of, I can make a game about this issue. So I think it's going to happen, if that even comes close to answering what you were asking.
I guess my perspective is that I agree with that. Newsrooms have always been closed ecosystems. I worked in newsrooms for, as I said, for 15 years, and I've never worked in one newsroom that had a tremendous amount of respect for another newsroom. Like even great world-class newsrooms I've worked in have always kind of, their journalism isn't as good as our journalism. So that's been the challenge, and I think that's really held back newsrooms, and it's been one of the reasons that we've seen such a horrible decline in newspapers. Is that newsrooms have had a hard time getting past that mentality and opening up their ecosystems. We are seeing a lot of encouraging signs. Certainly at PBS, Frontline is now working very closely with NPR, with NewsHour, with outside organizations like ProPublica. Frontline has a reporter, a producer in the ProPublica newsroom, and there are a lot of examples of that cropping up throughout public media. In our own in PBS Interactive, where I work, we've started a news and public affairs project, and it's very small. We've got about 6 or 7 people working on it, but our whole approach really is partnering, because I believe that the new media space is, you can't succeed without partnering. So we're going to be announcing over the next month or so some partnerships, some of which would be predictable and some of which I think are going to surprise people. Because our philosophy really is that the newsroom of the 21st century really needs to be an open ecosystem, not a closed one, and that so I'd be very open to having, and we have had discussions with gaming organizations around some of the games that you've mentioned, and I think that those would all be done through partnerships. We wouldn't feel like it had to be done in-house because of sort of journalistic quality issues. We feel that we want to have obviously a role and final say on it, but the gaming people are the experts in gaming. The social media people are the experts in social media. The search engine optimization. You need to partner with all these experts rather than always feel like you need to grow that talent in house.
Ivan, can you talk a little bit about partnering and include in your answer whether or not you could imagine partnering with any of the BBG organizations?
Well, I'd like to say that I don't think of citizen media and traditional journalism as necessarily in a dichotomy. I think there's all sorts of cross currents and engagements and partnerships and relationships that occur all the time, whether it's within the context of a traditional mass media outlet or newspaper, or whether it's in the context of our work, a kind of a ongoing series of pilots and partnerships with a variety of mass media. So, for example, our newsroom was funded by Reuters for the first 2.5-3 years of our existence, and Reuters had the right to republish all of our content with their brand. So we're certainly not, we're not opposed in some kind of fundamental polarized way. Right now we have partnerships with The Economist, with the BBC, with the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, as well as a number of nonprofit research organizations and humanitarian type of organizations. So we constantly think of partnering as a way of helping the curation function and the aggregation function that we play to reach larger audiences. And our real goal, actually, we translate the site into about 15 languages in a very substantial way, and another 15 languages in beta. And we're very interested in working with non-English partners to expand our content into other countries as well. So I think that this kind of partnership that you're talking about really is a way to add value and context to this kind of work. As far as Global Voices ever working with government broadcasters generally, not just the BBG, we have our board restricts us from taking government funding of any sort, and we have a rule that we don't work with broadcasters that are directly supported by states. So we don't work with state broadcasters. If there's a sufficient firewall, for instance, in the BBC context, that's different. So we would consider working with public broadcasters that have very clear guidelines, but no state broadcasters. And we don't because we're a global community and a Dutch nonprofit, we have a wide variety of political opinions within our community, and whoever we chose to work with, we would wind up offending somebody. And we find it simpler to try to focus on creating a platform that's focused on engagement and inclusion, even at the expense of potentially maybe an excess of caution in that regard. So it's not to say that I think that the BBG is bad or anything of that sort. That's not the point. The point is to try to create a platform where anybody feels that they have a place where they can be comfortable.
I want to ask Beth a question, and then I'm going to open it up to your questions. Jason mentioned media literacy, and I think, so that's my question concerns that. You alone, Beth, I think in today's program, have physical infrastructure in a community. You work in education, you're in the schools, you're sort of on the ground, and you're also connected to a national, august news brand. So I think you sort of span the whole vertical column. So my question, there was a recent OECD report on the whole issue of the new news ecosystem. And it concluded that 18 to 24-year-olds, while of course very digitally literate, have little media literacy. It said they rely heavily on search and, quote, view rather than read, and do not possess the critical and analytical skills to assess the information they find on the web. So we don't need to debate that proposition, but if it's true, is there anything that public media can do about that? Is that part of its mission? Or is the assumption that the brand, whether the brand is validated through transparency or validated through some other mechanism, itself will educate the consumer, particularly the young consumer, about what's credible?
Well, I mean, I certainly share your concern and everyone's concern about the media literacy of the younger generation. I would like to think that it would be as part of the portfolio of public television stations. I'm not sure that it's something that we can alone address by any stretch of the imagination. However, even in our community, we've done some very, very small projects with younger children about computer literacy. Again, these are very, very small projects, maybe 1 minute what we would call parent tips that would air in between our children's programs to educate parents, young parents, on very basic things, basically like you can't believe everything you read online, and to try and work with children in the schools about that. It's not something that we have personally been able to spend an awful lot of time on, but certainly an area that I would love to be able to.
Questions, your questions? Back there.
To say on a personal note, that's just fabulous work that you're doing. It's just wonderful to see it. We're all immigrants, just about everybody here, and to see you doing that work in Nashville is fantastic. But my congratulations.
Thank you.
My comment, though, linking back to the international broadcasters, is Voice of America does awesome international news in Somali, in Kurdish. Mm-hmm. And we get calls from, we had a call from a Somali language radio station in Minneapolis, the recruiting ground of al-Shabaab, to get young kids to go over and be trained and come back as terrorists, saying, hey, can we take VOA's program, put it on the air? And we had to say no, because of Smith-Mundt. So I just wanted to give that example to connect up the sort of connective tissue thing back to your world and our world. It'd be terrific if we could make some of our content available to your communities in places like Nashville who don't have a good grasp of English. Just wanted to make a quick comment on that. And the related comment, it's something I know Ivan's working on a great deal, is the whole issue of translation. And if we can really solve translation as a challenge, we can do a much better job of getting a lot more information to a lot of people from a lot of sources. And there's a huge amount of action on that issue, and we all need to be focused on it and trying to do it a whole lot better. So I just wanted to throw that out for consideration.
Yeah, and at NPT we are translating both this Next Door Neighbors project and our Children's Health Crisis project, which focuses again on local children's health. We are translating that into several different languages. And we translate a lot of our community engagement materials into different languages that help. And we hire native speakers to help us with our community engagement.
Back there, and then
I'm Kate Woodson. I'm a journalist with the Voice of America, and I apologize. It's not a question, but I wanted to seize the opportunity to sort of chip away further at the perception that the Voice of America is a propagandistic machine. It was sort of further asserted in the comment about the BBG being a state broadcaster. And so in each of these forums, I'm finding that this misperception is further implanted in people's minds. the Voice of America is governed or overseen by a charter that actually legally requires us to be unbiased and balanced. And so we're the only, I think, U.S. broadcaster required by law to practice good journalism practices. And just to explain, we're funded by Congress, but our content is as good or as neutral and unbiased as the journalist doing it. And I'm not a particular fan of the government, and every day I set out to do good journalism. But we do air editorials, and I think that's where the misperception comes from. So much like CNN takes a break for its commercial sponsor, the Grand Hyatt, we take a break for our commercial sponsor, Congress, essentially. And so at 5 minutes at the end of the hour, we'll air an editorial that has the views of the U.S. government, but it is separate from the journalism content that we are putting out. So we are not a state broadcaster, and I think it's really, really important to have that discussion later.
May I comment?
Oh, yeah, sure. And then we have Rena, and then
when I say state broadcaster, I simply mean a broadcaster that's directly funded by a state. So I think that under that definition, I'm not saying that's good or bad. The BBC is funded through a tax mechanism that through a license fee on televisions.
I just wanted to kind of respond and maybe clarify a little bit. My name is Rebecca McKinnon. I'm actually co-founder of Global Voices and work with Ivan. And sort of as co-founder and not executive director, maybe I can speak a little more frankly about some of our community, which I think also speaks to the challenges of public diplomacy in engaging particularly with citizen media around the world, which is that, I mean, one of the reasons why Global Voices doesn't take state funding directly, but also is a little bit cautious about its partnerships with media that are funded by states, has to do with the fact that we have bloggers who are volunteers from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia, etc. And we have to be very mindful of the implications of our partnerships for the individuals who are involved with our project. And there are a lot of people in our community who have made it very clear to us that if we were to engage in certain partnerships, they would leave because they would be afraid that they would be painted in their home country as being too close themselves by association to the United States government, which in their home country context is dangerous. And even though the facts may speak to VOA's independence and so on, unfortunately, facts are less relevant than reality, than perception on the ground when it comes to people's safety. And so they're going to act based on, is my affiliation with Global Voices, if it gets into a partnership with VOA, going to result in me being accused and perhaps tried and convicted of working for the U.S. government, even though, the actual objective facts would not be that way. One could envision such a scenario taking place. And so this is again, I think, when it comes down to public diplomacy and sort of the global conversation, where I think in some, there are some things that government and state or, directly government funded things can do well, and other things that perhaps are best done by more independent civil society entities. And that may just be the reality.
Just a couple of one comment and then a question. Where did Beth go?
She had to leave.
Oh,
she had to get on a flight.
While Beth is out of the room, I just wanted to say, I just want to echo, I just think it's great work that she's doing on the local communities. And I really think not only could some of that material be pitched and possibly used on some of the international broadcasters, but also I think the national media could take cue from that kind of programming as well, in terms of explaining, the immigrant community and really putting a face and a voice to that community that considers themselves as American as everybody else. So I just wanted to say, I think, and this gets back to the greater mission of public media, which I think is replacing many commercial players in the local space. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that. Local media has, if we think the national media and the international media is cutting back, local media is cutting back even further. And I think that public media has a huge responsibility on that side. My question is to Jay and perhaps Ivan as well may want to comment on this. And this is, Jay, I totally agree with you about partnerships. And I think partnerships are going to define journalism in the future. And very often I find that the people internally, and this doesn't, I'm not speaking for my news organization in particular, but what my, vast network of journalist friends tell me, the people who are most opposed to those are sometimes the managers. So I think we have to have, we have a lot of work to do as journalists in sort of explaining the reasons why certain partnerships make sense, especially in the area of investigative reporting. Investigative reporting is extremely expensive. There are very few news organizations that are doing it. It's an area where NGOs and nonprofit organizations are doing a lot of work that we could partner on and work together on. And I really fear that if we don't have more partnerships on investigative journalism, we're not going to have much of it. And I just wondered what your response to that was.
Well, first, I appreciate your comment about local, because really public PBS is the last frontier, the last man standing when it comes to locally owned and operated television stations in 360 markets across the country. So yes, we're very much aware of that heavy burden and responsibility and opportunity, frankly, to have a local national partnership. And if you look at what we've done on PBS.org, we've very much come out with an approach where PBS.org is now automatically localized based on where you're coming in from you're using your IP address, and we give you a mixture. We're just rolling this out now, so it's not in every market yet, but we provide a mixture of national content from the national producers and content from stations like Nashville and wherever you're coming in to PBS.org in the country. So very much, I think you raised a very important point about the disappearing locally owned television stations and public broadcasting being the last opportunity there. I agree with you also in terms of the challenges in terms of partnerships and the fact that newsrooms, particularly, yes, when it comes to investigative reporting, and for some good reasons too, obviously, that investigative reporting is also carries with it substantial risks on the legal side and on the financial side in terms of legal liability. So you do want to pick your partners carefully. However, it's been very encouraging over the last several years, the proliferation. That may be too strong of a word, but we're seeing a lot of several new and nonprofit endeavors that are focused on investigative reporting. We're seeing those pop up, and as I said, I think public media, both NPR and PBS, have tried to be in the forefront in terms of forging partnerships with those organizations such as ProPublica. And as I said, we'll be announcing some more in the coming month or two. So, agree, it's challenging, but it's absolutely crucial.
Tom is going to wrap us up.
We have to finish and empty the room for the next event. So, just to first of all thank all the panelists in the second panel, and mention that we will be writing up a report on this discussion and the questions it's raised. We'll post it on our respective websites sometime in the future, sometime in the early new year. And for all of those who RSVP'd electronically and agreed to share your email with us, we will email it out to you. If you'd like further, more detailed discussion, please come and see Sean, Ellen, or myself. Second, I need to thank Sama Abdulaziz from Georgia State, Ali Perez and Preston Ray and the others from New America who have battled badge printers and basically done the hard work. And finally, to thank you all for attending. Hope you've enjoyed the discussions, and do keep in touch. Thank you again, and thank you to the panelists.
Yeah, I definitely like to do this.